Welcome to the Magical Journey podcast, where cryptids stalk the tree line, shadows whisper back, and the night sky is never as empty as it seems. We follow the footprints, chase the lights, and dig into the conspiracies hiding just out of sight. Listener discretion advised. The ideas and opinions expressed in this show are based on research and personal testimony, and belong to the guests, not necessarily the host.
Well, what if I told you guys that one of the biggest and most important cases in UFO history, bigger than Roswell, was probably something you didn't even see or notice or take notice of very much? What if I told you that you are ill-informed, once again, by one of the biggest cases, is literally one of the biggest cases of our time? Well, today, my guest, Dr. Scott, is here to explain to us what I'm talking about and help us get to the bottom of not only that, but to understand a little bit more of our world around us today. So, without further ado, I am going to bring to the stage Dr. Irena Scott. Hey.
Hi.
Hey, can you hear me pretty well over there?
Just fine.
Okay, good deal. So, Dr. Scott, our folks are probably not, they're familiar with you, most likely, but give us a little clue about your background, because you've got a history. You've got a great history.
Well, my history is mainly in science. It's not in UFOs. I started out wanting to be an astronomer, and they didn't hire females. And so I majored in it, and then I tried to get into it, and I worked for, as a physical scientist for the Geospatial Mapping Agency. And then I worked at the DIA in different things such as aircraft identification from satellites. And then I got married and moved to Nevada and went to the University of Nevada and got a master's degree, and then got a Ph.D. from the School of Veterinary Medicine at University of Missouri. And then I had a variety of positions, such as one of them was professor at St. Bonaventure and postdoc at Cornell. And I was in toxicology at the Ohio Department of Health and Battelle, and worked at the Ohio State University Medical School on a grant. So my profession and credentials aren't in ufology.
Absolutely not. And that's one of the things that I find not just interesting, but exciting, because something pulled you out of that part of your world into an interest in something that seems so completely different. Tell us a little bit about what led you to going from, because you were even, at that time, it wasn't, you had to be impressive to be a female and to work in those, and to work in those lines. So what happened that made you go, wait a minute, this is different?
Well, that was my own experience. When I was a small child, my sister and I had a close encounter. It was years before we ever knew what UFOs were. And you weren't, at that time, you weren't supposed to talk about UFOs, but we didn't know, what UFOs were, never heard of it. So we talked about it a lot. And I had several other sightings. Then my sister and I had another close encounter. And so I was in science, so I didn't talk about it for quite a few years, but it was always there. And so finally, as I got closer to retirement and things, I always had an interest, but finally I decided to follow it up.
Wow. Yeah, because I mean, that tends to be what happens with a lot of us is we have an early on experience. An early on experience. Now, you would eventually come in contact with a young man who, because of his experience early on, had a life altering event. But before that even happened, there was something that happened that was so mundane to most people's everyday existence that started this ball rolling, so to say. A phone call from your mom.
Yes.
Now
My,
tell us about it.
my mother was a skeptic, and she'd always said that, besides that, she'd always said that if we ever thought she was getting dementia, we should tell her. Well, she was living in Ohio and I was living in Missouri. And she called me one night and said, "Did you hear that explosion?" And I said, "No." And she kept asking me. And I started telling her that we were 600 miles apart. And, and so I finally told her, "You're cuckoo." And so, but it made an impression on me because this isn't something normal she'd do. And then several days later, she called and said there was this huge UFO flap going on in Ohio. And that people were keeping their kids in, keeping in at night and having sightings, and a UFO chased their best friend in a car and things like that. And they were just, which was very unusual for her. Well, I was in Missouri and I didn't pay too much attention to it, but later I moved to Ohio. And once I was in the library, the Ohio State University Library, and at that time they had real newspapers, actual newspapers in this huge vault room. And just for some unknown reason, on impulse, I thought I'd look up when that noise was. And I really didn't know. I was just guessing that it was the middle of October in '73, and I walked into the newspaper room and thought, I'll never find this in a million years. And so I looked, and I found it without too much looking. And I just found a little tiny article about a strange noise, but it was at the right date. And then I did some more reading and found out that at that time, also there's this huge flap going on. And so for some reason, I got interested in it and they couldn't explain it. And so I started doing research and found out it was this huge noise that was way past any sonic boom or anything. And I submitted a paper to I didn't know much about UFOs or the literature then either. I submitted a paper to a scientific journal, and the state seismologist of Ohio became interested, and he helped me investigate and look up seismograph recordings and stations and things. And so it turned out that this was, it happened the same time as the Pascagoula. And I read at that time about this Pascagoula abduction. I didn't pay a bit of attention to that. I was just interested in the sound. But many years later, I had submitted a UFO manuscript to Philip Mantle, and he had accepted it. And not too long after that, he published the book by Charles Hickson about the Pascagoula abduction. And there were two people in that, and one of them was Calvin Parker, who hadn't talked about it for 50 years or so and didn't want anything to do with it. Well, Philip and his wife, after all his silence, managed to convince him to start talking about it. And he wound up writing a couple of books that Philip Mantle published. And he had this real bad attitude because people made fun of you and harassed you and everything else. Well, this came out about the same time as things began to open up with the tic-tac and everything. And he wasn't getting harassed. He was getting very, very respected, and people wanted to hear from him. And interview him and everything else, and they were showing him interest and not, saying you're crazy and all that. And so the sound I heard was the same time as the abduction. So after all these years in between, I wound up working on Pascagoula again because Philip Mantle is in England and they have an English accent, and Pascagoula is in Mississippi and they have an accent. And I was kind of in between, and he kind of wanted somebody else to interview him, and he asked me to. And I was very happy to, because by that time I was interested in it on account of my previous work on the sound. And so it, it was something I'd already worked on for years and years and years ago. So I was very happy.
Now, a lot of us, when we first read this story or heard about this story, we had a lot of preconceived notions about just, from the lack of information at the time, that this was, just another event. These guys were, Mississippi hooligans as far as we knew, and and they saw what they thought was a flying saucer. A lot of people kept saying, that maybe there was Hickson had a habit of nipping the bottle occasionally. A lot of people were like, maybe they were drinking that day. So we had a lot of preconceived notions. But what were some of the things, when you first heard about the case, what were some of the things that you found out early on that led you to start changing your thought process? Because I know, to begin with, it had to you said you totally blew it off at first. What were the things that you found out that started making you raise your eyebrow?
Well, there were a number of things. I totally blew it off. I mean, I had no interest, and it just sounded crazy to me for many, many years, and then suddenly. But one thing is there were two witnesses. They were, abductions aren't considered, they're considered often crazy, and the ufologists usually just throw them away. Well, what was different, and a lot of times it's for the reason there's no documentation. People go out in the middle of nowhere and have an abduction. There's no witnesses, nothing to substantiate it, no documentation or anything. And lots of times they don't remember it. And if they do, it's under hypnosis. So there's a whole lot of things that don't add up and don't make sense. Well, in this case, there were two of them, and they both were conscious and remembered it. Although Calvin said for years and years and years that he fainted, but he actually did remember it. And that was a lot different than normal. And they, a lot of times they say somebody's hoaxing for attention. Well, Calvin didn't speak about it for 50 years. And he was not hoaxing for attention because he didn't want the attention. And there was just an excellent investigation of it, because it was, at that time, it was hard to even report anything, because it was considered crazy and there was no place to report it. And first of all, they tried reporting it to the newspaper, and the newspaper was closed and said, get out of the way. Then they tried to report it to the Air Force. There was an Air Force base, and the Air Force said, well, we closed Project Blue Book years ago. UFOs don't exist, only nuts see them and all that. But they told him to call the local police. Well, Calvin, of course, didn't want to, but Charles did. And Charles did report it immediately. This was right after it happened. And what was pretty amazing is the police did a real good investigation. They first of all separated them and interviewed them separately. Then they put them together and interviewed them. But what they didn't tell them was, then the interviewer left, but there was a hidden tape recorder. And the police wanted to know if they were hoaxing. And they figured if they were together in a room and nobody was there and they were hoaxing, they'd be laughing about it. But instead, they were just practically having heart attacks. They were so scared and nervous and everything else, which you'd be if you'd been abducted. And I mean, you could, the tape is on the internet now, and you can see how stressed they are. And Calvin started praying and everything. They were just out of their minds. And so this, unlike most things where there's put aside and thrown out and non-investigated, this was well investigated, and the people were very sincere, and everybody that talked to them believed them, that they believed that this happened to them, and they were sincere, they weren't hoaxing. So it was also a real good investigation and done immediately afterwards. And they had a lot of top investigators working on them too.
Right. That was one of the things about this case. See, when I would hear about it or read about it, it was, I mean, I was a kid back then, so, we would hear about it kind of on like the Leonard Nimoy show, or that he did back then, or some other thing, and they would brush over the details a little bit. I don't even remember it being an abduction case when I heard it the first time, to be honest with you. With that, though, tell me about, because it was very traumatic for Calvin. He was a 19-year-old boy. Tell us, in the most kind words you can, because it is very touchy subjects with UFO abductions. What exactly happened that was, first of all, let's hear your perception of what you thought happened, and then what you heard from them later on.
Well, I didn't pay any attention to it at all until I started working with Philip Mantle. Mm-hmm. And then I heard from them, not from, Charles was dead by then, but I read his book. And what happened was they were just normal people about their normal lives. They weren't UFO nuts or anything like that. They'd had their day of work, and they decided to go fishing, which they were down there in Pascagoula, where there's rivers and oceans and gulfs and everything. That's what people do, is go fishing. And so they did the normal thing after work and went fishing. And it was just their normal life. Calvin had a new car, and they were looking for a good fishing spot, and they didn't find it at first. But then Charles said, well, there's this good spot here. And it had a no trespassing sign up, and a lot of weeds and debris and everything to get to the pier, which Calvin wasn't very thrilled about because he had this new car, but and he was afraid. And so anyway, Charles was an older man. He was in his 40s, and he had military experience. He'd had life and death situations in a war. And so he was kind of so that he could take something. Calvin was a young teenager, and with his whole life ahead of him. And, if he said UFO back then, everybody'd say, oh, what'd you do this morning? Did you see a UFO and all that, and so on, and harassment. So he didn't want to have anything to do with it. But anyway, I mean, they were at different stages in their life, and they were family friends. Calvin's father was a friend of the older man, and the older man's son was a friend of Calvin. And so they went to the pier and began fishing. And then they saw a blue light. And Calvin interpreted this as the police after him, and his car was there. And he was going to say, well, put Charles in jail because it was his idea. Don't do anything with me. But it turned out to be much, much, much worse than the police, because this thing came and it wasn't like an airplane or anything. It was levitating, and no airplane sign or nothing that an airplane would do like that. And it opened some way, and all this light came out, and these three things came out, and two of them grabbed Charles and one grabbed Calvin, and they took him in to this thing. And in general, both of them kind of remembered being scanned. Charles said they couldn't really see anything because it was just real bright light, like they were in a light bulb or something. But Charles said this thing came out of the wall, and I mean, he couldn't really see it until it was close to him because it was so bright. But then it was like it scanned him. And Calvin said the same thing, like they were scanned. And then they were, of course, terrified, and they were wondering if this was done by the government, but they were also wondering if this was done by, UFOs. And so they were wondering why, will they return me? Will they kill me? Will they put me in a zoo, or what's going to happen to me? And then they were released, and they were both having nervous trouble then. I mean, after they released, Calvin was standing on the end of the pier with his arms out, just in a posture like that, which is something that can happen. A strange posture can happen if you're really having a nervous breakdown or something like that. And Charles at first couldn't stand up, and then he could stand up, so he could, and he had to kind of wake up Calvin, who was kind of in a trance. And so then this was just totally traumatic. And if that happened to you, nobody believed you, and especially back then. And so Calvin didn't want to say anything about it. And they discussed it, and they said, we're not going to talk about it. But then Charles had military experience. He had been in life and death situations. And he thought this might be that important, that it might be an invasion, it might be anything, and that he should report it. So he then did, which Calvin disagreed with him for 50 years.
Yeah, there was a lot of, I heard the video or the audio of their conversation, and it's very disturbing to hear Calvin talking, because you can tell the fear in his voice. Now, you said that there was 2 witnesses to the abduction. Let me ask you that, were there any other people involved close by to the abduction?
Well, that's what's interesting about this particular incident is that with most abductions, there's no documentation at all. Well, in this one, we're still finding more witnesses. There was a lot of witnesses, and one of them, the first 2 people I interviewed were the Blair family, and we found them because Calvin, after he started talking about it, was on YouTube and had a video talking about the abduction. And this woman wrote in and said, yeah, my parents saw it. And so Philip contacted them, and I began interviewing them. And I began interviewing Maria Blair. And she said that, the first, his daughter, one of the comments she made was, but my parents were abducted, they just saw it. But what happened was they were on the other side of the Pascagoula River and saw this activity. And then later they found out about the abduction report. And they said, they thought, well, this is what we saw, but they didn't say anything and just told their own family. But 50 years later, their daughter made a comment on YouTube. And so anyway, It was Jerry and Maria Blair, and I contacted Maria Blair, and she said that they were sitting in their car, and he was going out in a ship to the oil rigs, but he was waiting for his supervisor to come who was late. And so they were sitting there in the car, and he went to sleep, and she was just watching. And she said this thing was flying around that she thought was an airplane, but it didn't behave like an airplane because it was just flying around. She kept saying, well, it was searching for something, or the pilot is lost. He doesn't know where he's going. It was just flying around and around and around and around. Then she said that her husband decided to take his clothes to the car, and so they'd have to go down to the ship, and they'd have to walk down the pier and get in the ship and everything. She said it was about 9 o'clock, and he was walking down the pier in front of her, and as she was walking along, this thing that looked like a person just flopped up right in front of her on the pier, and then it went back down, and it never came back up to breathe for air, and she was just terrified, and she was very, very, very emotional about that. And then they went on down to the ship, and she didn't come back until about 12. She was terrified, and she ran up the pier to her car. Well, there were two things that, rang bells in my head, and one of them was that this thing that flopped up on the pier, and I asked her if it was a fish or a dolphin, and she said, no, it looked like a person. And she was very emotional about it. And then the other thing was that I wondered what happened, why they had 3 hours on the ship, and she didn't seem to be saying anything about what they were doing. And so anyway, I just kept in contact with her. She was the first person I interviewed, and I didn't know too much about it. I just said, just interviewing witnesses, but there were these two things that I paid attention to. And so a number of years later, about 2 years later, her husband became very sick, and then he was put on a ventilator and unfortunately died. But just before he went on the ventilator, he told her that they had been abducted, but that he had never told her, and that he was in some kind of contact with these whatever they were, and that he felt protective of her, and he had told them not to bother her, to harm her. And so this was, not only was she wondering what on earth happened with all this, but then she finds out her husband seems to have been in contact with the UFO beings, and that would be pretty traumatic. And then Philip had her hypnotized after a while because her husband just died and nobody wanted to intrude on her for a while. But she kind of wanted to be hypnotized. And she remembered a little bit more about the abduction under hypnosis. But so that this was very unusual because usually with an abduction, there's one person and that's it. Well, here, there were two other witnesses that not only saw something, but may have been abducted themselves. So that was just totally unusual.
Right. And now, unrelated to this case, but something I want to throw in there. There was one instance, and I want to say in New York, of an abduction where a woman was taken out of her apartment at night through the window, and several people on the road into town or wherever it was actually witnessed this woman coming out of her window and floating up into the air. That is another one of those stories that you will hear nothing about anywhere unless you really deep dive. And I forget the details myself because I was just reading it. Robin Quell, who was a regressionist, handed me the article to read one day. And I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely something new. Now, you said there were several, and your book, which I'll bring up here in a moment. You have a couple of really great books on the Pascagoula story. You said there were a number of witnesses that have come forward over time. Can you give us an estimate of about how many so far?
Quite a few, like I'm estimating like about 100. Um, uh, when it happened that same night, the police not only heard from Charles, but from the the police person that was taking notes at the phone, said that he had heard from about 50 people, and then more on the bridge that reported UFOs. And it was really hard to report anything like that because you had to, if you just said UFO, everybody'd laugh at you. And there was no place to report it. And like Charles had to try 3 times before he got his report out. But in spite of that, there were about 50 people that saw something odd that night. And this was before they would have been influenced by anything. They saw something. And then we began, when we started investigating, things were more open and people would talk about it. And so I interviewed about 50 more people. So there were a lot of people that saw something that bothered them enough that they phoned it or called it immediately or remembered it.
And that in itself is extremely, like, again, like you said, with a lot of the abduction cases and so forth, a lot of them just get pushed up because you don't have those kind of numbers to work with. You just don't. Let me ask you this, just to kind of clarify with people, give people an idea. What was Calvin's demeanor when off camera when you talked to him?
I didn't interview him.
Oh, you never actually interviewed him?
I
Oh,
talked to him on a show, but I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you get a chance to actually like talk to him after the show at all?
No, but
No.
everybody trusted him. Everybody that met him.
Yeah. I gather, like, honestly, everything I've heard about him was that he was just a very genuine, very likable guy. He was, I mean, hard to call him a kid because as 50 years later, he was a grown man. But um, when we talk about this case, there were some things that you said that kind of parallel some of the stuff I've heard other abductees, or the body scanning, and other things. What are some of the things that you find to be very interesting in the sense that they overlap and they agree with other cases that have nothing to do with this?
Well, one thing, I just compare them to a number of other cases of abductions. And I actually had a chapter on abduction observables, which they have UFO observables. And so I thought I'd say abduction observables. Things that are in common about abductions. One of them is that oftentimes abductions will start with a light, and oftentimes it's a strange light. And like the one you were talking about in New York, this light transported her up to the object. And Calvin's in there. This one, Pascagoula, started out with, they didn't exactly know exactly what happened. They think it had a door that opened some way, and all this light came out. And that was one of the things that I said is in common. And a lot of times the light has strange properties, and sometimes not only are things abducted, but whole trucks and things like that are abducted, and especially if there's a green beam of light coming down. Sometimes a truck will, the witnesses will report their truck was abducted and they were in it, and things like that, which, but another thing that is in common is that the objects just appear. I mean, like with an airplane, they take off from an airport and fly in a certain path and then they land. With UFOs, they just appear and disappear, and that's it. They don't have a flight path. Another thing is, which happened here, I mean, it just kind of appeared. They didn't know where it came from or anything else, except that a lot of people saw something. So, but they didn't know where it came from or anything like that. Another thing is, sometimes in abductions, well, normally, there's things that look like beings. And in this case, what they reported is they thought they were robots, that they behaved in a mechanical way. And nobody believed them then. Back then, everybody thought, oh, there's, beings in these things. But I've looked over a lot of other abduction reports, and a lot of abduction reports say that these beings look exactly alike and things like that, which makes me think, there's robots or something. Also, when they're inside, in this case, there was nothing except all this bright light. And that could be due to robots. I mean, robots don't need furniture and food and all that. They can just close up and start up again. Another thing I was mentioning was time. And another thing that in some abductions, it's like tape recording. And I've talked to people that say they were living their normal lives, and then everything around them stopped, and they were pulled up and abducted, and then returned, and it's like they stopped a movie of your life going through and pulled you out and stuck you back in and turned everybody back on, and things like that. Wow. And physical laws. In this case, this thing they saw levitated. There was no airplane sound, no wings, no nothing like the Tic Tac object. It just, it was just there. And it wasn't on the ground. And these beings, or whatever they were, also levitated. They didn't walk on the ground. And when another thing that happens is, a lot of times when it happens, the people are paralyzed or like they're in a trance. And that's what happened to these, to them. They thought they might have been given shots, but which would be very unusual, because a lot of people just report, well, suddenly they can't move and they're paralyzed, which, that would be absolutely terrifying, to have somebody grab you and, take you aboard, and when you can't move, like your worst nightmare. And so I just went through a lot of things that were in common about abductions.
Yes, definitely so. Lots. I mean, you listed all the things that, like, going back to the Betty and Barney Hill. Okay, so we're going to get into, because as we start to get closer to the hour mark, I want to talk about this for a minute, because I feel like this is very important. Now, tell us a little bit about what Pascagoula is, as far as his connection to all of us, like even people that don't even suspect we're connected. as far as the military aspect of it that you can talk about at least?
Well, this is something that we worked on it for 3 or 4 years and nobody noticed. And it's been, well-known abduction and sighting for all these years, and nobody paid a bit of attention to it until I was talking to some military people about missile sites and about UFOs over missile sites. And this made me, and somebody else said there was a cover-up. Well, this made me go back and look in my many government reports and things like that. And there were reports in it that this was a nuclear site. Well, this was something that I hadn't paid attention to and nobody else had. I mean, it completely slipped by, but this was a nuclear site. I mean, where they were abducted was very, very close to a nuclear site. And the reason why you wouldn't notice it was because you think of nuclear sites as, missile silos or like Hanford or something like that. But what was here was just a shipbuilder. However, this was a shipbuilder that was building nuclear submarines, and some of these nuclear submarines had nuclear missiles. So it was just like Area 51 or something. I mean, or a missile site. I mean, they make all this attention on missile sites and UFOs over missile sites. Well, this was the same thing, and nobody noticed it because it was a shipbuilder, and nobody, associates shipbuilders with nuclear sites.
Right. Now, I find this very, very interesting because somebody very close to me works at the Australian facility in Mobile, Alabama. So because of conversations I've had with her, I know a little bit about some of this stuff. And I found it, when I read this in your book, I found it very interesting. Now, did Calvin and Charles work at this site?
At first, I had trouble figuring that out. They worked for a shipbuilder called Walker, and the shipbuilder that made that did the with the nuclear subs was Huntington Ingalls Incorporated, but Walker there was a father Walker, and then it split into several of his sons, but Huntington Ingalls owned one part of the Walker thing, so that Calvin and Charles didn't work for Huntington Ingalls, but Huntington Ingalls owned part of the Walker family shipbuilders, so there was a relationship, and then the place where they worked was real close to Huntington Ingalls, and where they were abducted was real close.
Very important pieces of information, I think. And I think you really hit on, this is what renewed my interest in the story. When I read, and I am still reading, this book is a gold mine. The first one is like the first one I picked up, and it's a gold mine. I'm going to show you guys this. Tell our guys on here a little bit about your book, this first one, and because it's brilliant. I got to tell you, like, for somebody like me that's one big old book nerd, I'm having a field day with this.
Well, there was a vast amount of information, and this completely slipped by everybody for 50 or more years. Good investigators, top-notch people, the top UFO people and scientists, and nobody realized this was a military site, but they pay a whole lot of attention to military sites and UFOs over nuclear sites and that. And nobody ever realized that this was a nuclear site. And the company that builds the ships, it has two sections. Another section is Newport News in Virginia, and they're making not only nuclear submarines, but nuclear submarines with some of them called ballistic missiles.
Mhm.
And this is very important because I've read that today, and maybe back then, most of our nuclear force is actually in submarines. And you think of, these big missile sites and all that and airplanes, but apparently most of it's in submarines. And it's something you wouldn't even think about until now.
Right.
And it's like the UFOs were kind of ahead of us, that maybe they were realizing something was going on there. Another thing that's very nerve-wracking is that there's mental effects from the UFOs, and this is by a nuclear missile site. And people that actually in the workplace there saw UFOs circling their site and things like that.
Mhm.
And a lot of witnesses saw the UFOs near the site. You couldn't tell exactly where they were, but they were probably, a number of them were over the actual missile site. And this is like, and there were electronic effects too. And so I think this is really, really important to have not only UFOs, but UFOs affecting people's minds on a nuclear missile site where, you can start World War III and destroy the world and stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, see, this was one of the things when I first started reading about that in the book, I was like, this makes so much sense why they tried to blow this story off years ago. Because, back then we knew nothing. Like, even as far, like, even in the 90s, we knew very little about, things just weren't talked about like that. Um, Now, the next book that I have not even touched this one yet because I'm still so engrossed in the other one. But you co-authored this book, correct?
With
Now,
Philip Mantle.
and Philip is the one who, by the way, I'm pretty sure, yes, he was the one who told me, said, "Hey, I'm having some medical issues, but this is who you really want to talk to anyway."
Unfortunately,
Yeah, yeah. He spoke very highly of you being the person I really wanted to talk to anyway, as he said. Now, this is not just a sequel to your book, but it goes even deeper, correct?
well, we called it Beyond Reasonable Doubt because we were comparing it to court cases,
Mm,
and with abductions, like they're always considered nothing happened and all that. Well, we were saying that we had enough circumstantial evidence that this could convince a court because of all the other witnesses and their descriptions.
mm. Wow, wow, that is amazing. You guys check out these books because I promise you, like, if you like reading informative stuff, not the fluff that we get a lot of times now, but real informative, important, groundbreaking stuff, then this is one of the books to definitely check out. Um, before we uh, before we end the night here, what I do want to ask you, what is what's something that you would like to leave us with uh, about your experiences, about what you would like to tell people who are maybe younger people who are just now getting involved in researching?
Well, I think things have changed a lot since uh, ever since UFOs began. The government has always said they don't exist, and they've had obstructions, and like Project Blue Book was, was supposed to be investigating, but proving they don't exist and all that. So finally, the government has just opened up the tiniest little bit,
Mhm.
And um, one thing that people disagree that well, back then they thought we were the only planet in the universe, and now they're discovering planets all over. There's probably more planets than there are stars and all that. So the idea of astronomy and the idea that we are the only beings in the universe, I'm sure, is different now than it was. Because back then you could say, "Oh, we're the only intelligent life in the universe." Well, now there may be intelligent life all over, and we may not be that intelligent either. And so, astronomy has changed, but also the government attitude, and people are a lot more open-minded. And in this case, you have a lot of observations that don't make sense, such as objects levitating and time being turned off and all that. But that is like the newest quantum mechanic theories and measurements that they're doing now in physics that make no sense at all, too. And so I think this isn't that strange now for those two reasons.
Definitely. We have come a long way. The social, cultural, and political climates are very different now than they were in the 1970s, the 1980s. One thing I do want to bring to people's attention too is it's very interesting that the flap that we've discussed tonight is only about 7 years after another very large flap in the Midwest, correct? The 1965, 66, wasn't there also a fairly large one there in the Midwest area?
Yeah, I think this was probably the largest one ever, though.
Definitely.
It was huge. I mean, there were a lot of humanoid sightings and that sort of thing too. And just that night when the abduction took place, that sound was heard over a vast area of the country, like about half the length of the country. And there were very, very many witnesses for that. And I don't know how it ties in, but they call, instead of UFOs now, it's UAP. Mm. Well, this is phenomena that happened all on one night, and I don't know, how it's connected or whether it is, but there was just a huge flap on that one night, and then there was another night about a week later when there was also just a huge number of sightings.
Very interesting. It would be very interesting to go back to 1973 and see exactly what all was going on at that time that we may have not thought about that may be connected to this. Excuse me. I appreciate your time tonight so very much. I have high regard and respect for you, not only because of the challenges you faced and you did not give up early on. For women everywhere, it was a difficult time to be heard and seen early on in the days when you were starting out. So that alone is enough to have high regard for you. But the fact that everybody, like, I've talked to people all week long about this interview and they were like, "Oh my goodness, I love her." So you have a lot of fans.
Great.
you have a lot of people who love and respect you dearly. So we definitely appreciate you coming on tonight. I apologize for some of the technical issues. This is a new thing. I don't know. Me and some of my other fellow podcasters were talking about some of this tonight before the shows, because 2 or 3 of us have shows on Friday night. And I feel like it's interesting that we're all having these little tidbits of problems all at the same time. Again, if you have not read any or not read all of the books yet, um, definitely go to the website. Is a good. I want to ask you something else really quickly because I've always been curious, and we have about 2 minutes left. So you were on Art Bell also at one point, right?
I've been on Coast to Coast several times.
So I got to know, how was that?
Well, one thing that impressed me was I had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning because it's on the radio.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Like one of the last ones, both of us together talked to George Knapp, who is a top researcher, and it went real well. We were just had a lot. I mean, both of us had a lot to say and everything, and so did he.
Wow. And you also know Katie Page, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Katie. Katie is an amazing lady too, with a lot of experiences. Well, I'm going to close this out, but I really appreciate you coming on so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you very much for having me. I'm hoping to make people more interested in the idea that there are UFOs over nuclear sites.
Right, right. You know what? That is going to be part of my focus for 2026, is to get people to understand that this is not just this one incident, that this is a full-blown thing. And so this is kind of a kickoff to part of what I'm going to be doing next year, is really focusing on the importance of people understanding that this is not just about some cute little green men coming to, say hello to us, that these people, these creatures, beings, are very interested in things that make me a little nervous, to be honest with you.
Certainly made me nervous.
Right, right. All right. I appreciate you. I will be in contact with you definitely some more, and I'm sure I'll have some questions for you through time.
Great.
Thank you again, and I will talk with you soon.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow. I know you guys are having a hard time hearing me, so I'm going to make this really quick and close as possible. This has probably been one of the most amazing experiences tonight, because what Dr. Scott is telling us is very important information. I wanted to bring out the story of the Pascagoula abduction, not just because of its importance historically to confirm an abduction case, but also the connection to the arsenal that it is part of. And we'll go into deeper detail about that at another time, because to understand, the Navy is a very large part of our defense, a very large part. If you notice, more and more over time, it has been the foremost used organization. So this will give you a little bit of a hint of where I'm going with talking about this particular subject. But anyway, it is the weekend. I know you guys are ready to go. Despite the fact that this may have been a little bit nerve-wracking at times tonight, have a safe and happy week, and I hope. And as always, may your journey always be magical.
I've waited for so long to see when you come back to me through the wars and battles that were lost. We're born again, it's you and me. The rest is history. Past lives. Past lives. Did we dance together on different floors in 1500 or 1504? We must have been lovers. We must have been something in our past life.